But from that base, you need to talk to all Canadians. You need to actually have an answer on all the issues that a government can address. But I spoke to Bruce Carson for my book, not about most of the stuff people would want to ask Bruce Carson about, but and he said that the amount of preparation they put in between the 2004 election, which they lost, and the 2006 election, which they won, just the huge amount of preparation they put into platform development, caucus committees, multiple drafts. People who hadn't been working on this chapter of the platform would say, well, what about this, what about that? And the committee would have to go back to the drawing board. And that wasn't communication particularly, but it was, it produced answers on questions like transport, road development, borders, and on, that were awful handy when later they started looking for something to communicate. I don't think these are entirely only matters of style. And I've seen way too many people think they could get far with nothing but style. And then, like Michael Ignatieff, in the end, it turns out they didn't even have much style. You know.
Chantal?
I'm not going to say that it's a style issue, not a substance issue. I would mildly disagree with Paul on the notion that you need to work on occupying policy ground that other parties deny themselves. I think you've done too good a job at that. And in the end, it's not only policy ground that others won't occupy, but it builds a fence between you and a lot of voters. I think you need to rethink what conservatism is in a 21st century Canada. I don't think not having an environment policy beyond the economy comes first is an acceptable policy for a serious party, and I don't think having an environment policy is the sign of a progressive party. It's just the sign of a modern party. I think you've got ledgers of modern reality that you have conveniently set aside, saying, well, you know, I don't want to go there. So the work-life balance issue is a good one. We are not going to go back to the day when one parent was at home and one was earning a living. This is not going to happen. People who go to Tim Hortons don't dream of that for their daughters. Aspirational policies are not the purview of progressive parties, or if you think they are, why would you be spending the weekend here if you didn't aspire to a different vision? And conveniently, at every step of the way, these issues have been put under the label, this is progressive, so we are good because we are against this. I'll take a stupid example. It's okay to believe that the monarchy is important and that it should have more of a place in the public space of Canada. But it is possible to actually, like the monarchy, like the Charter of Rights and Freedom, and like Medicare. Most Canadians actually are of that persuasion. This either of or, everything we had before 1970 was great, and everything that happened after that we want to deny. It no more works than the Parti québécois' efforts to turn the clock back on a Québec pur laine Québec and believe that younger Quebecers are going to be attracted to their cause because they're going to bring them around to those old ancient values. You need to come to mainstream Canadians. That doesn't mean going to the center, but it does mean engaging on issues that are important to a hell of a lot of voters.
Anthony.
And I want to pick up on something Paul said in his opening remarks, where he said, like 10, 15, or longer years ago, Stephen Harper would give these policy lectures where he'd deeply explain exactly why he was doing what he did and why it mattered. And I don't want my opening remarks to be mistaken for, okay, no, you got to be a bit more left-wing. I mean, if anything, keep being conservative, or as Paul said, be even more conservative, and explain it better and sell it better. Because I think there are so many times when there are conservative politicians who want to be sneaky about being conservative. Now, I'm not really cutting this program. I'm really doing a pretty centrist thing out there. Don't worry. Now I'm going to trick you into thinking it's not conservative. You know what? If you think the policy or if you think the program should be cut, if you think the funding should be canceled, and you firmly believe that, you probably have a good argument for it. And if you go out there and you sell it with conviction, and you're standing at the podium at the scrum until the questions run out, and you take on all comers and you explain why, to my previous point, you think this is a good thing for the country, I think you'll prevail, rather than doing what I call, and it was definitely under the Harper government, but I think Tim Hudak tried to do it, and I think there's a chance we're seeing Patrick Brown might do it, what I call sneaky conservatism. No, we're still a liberal sensibility. No, just bring people over to your side and explain why your position is right. You don't need to gloss it up as sort of faux liberalism, because Kathleen Wynne is a whole hell of a lot better at being Kathleen Wynne than you are.
That I can agree with, yes. Mercedes.
I would say that I think it's style and it's substance. I'll give you an example. We didn't get to ask a lot of questions to Stephen Harper when he was the Prime Minister. But there was a couple of occasions where we actually got a background briefing and then were able to ask questions, and one of them would have been to do with Chinese companies buying into the oil sands. And Stephen Harper came in and he answered a lot of questions. And I remember thinking, wow, he really knows this file. He's got, this is not superficial, he's giving us political talking points. He understands what the issues here are. He knows where the pitfalls are. He's accepting that, he's moving forward. And I think if you look at the coverage that came out of that, it was pretty good. And I don't mean necessarily positive, that people were writing this with a positive spin, but it was comprehensive. People understood what they were talking about. They felt the questions had been answered. There wasn't a sense that people were hiding behind something, that there was something they didn't want to tell us, and let's dig until we find out what it is, which, let me tell you, is every reporter's first instinct. If you give a surface level line that's not real communication of who you are and what you're about, is what are they hiding? There's something here. I'm going to dig until I find it. Sometimes there's nothing, but that's the instinct. And the narrowing as well of participation in ideas. And this goes to what I think so many of my colleagues have said on the panel, that to have a party that is more broad and accepting of all different kinds of conservatism, and not determining that only certain people are allowed to make decisions or have input, and anybody who doesn't is a pariah or a traitor, and is taken out of that decision-making process, where you end up having people who are all reinforcing each other's sometimes bad ideas, and sometimes great ideas, but to not have that challenge function, because that somehow represents a threat instead of an opportunity to grow, is something that I think the movement has to rethink.
Okay, well, I see always time for applause. I see people lined up at the mic, so maybe instead of me asking some questions, I'll throw it to you, because they're probably going to be more insightful. So I'll start to my right, and we'll go back and forth.
I like what you say, that conservatives need to communicate a lot better and reach out beyond its base. And I'm learning communication skills enough that I can speak in a room with so many people. Holy mackerel. But most universities are liberal. Do you have a tip or two how conservatives, or where conservatives, can learn to communicate clearly, effectively, with style, and maybe a bit of humor? One or two tips on where we can learn to communicate. And my question is for Mercedes.
Sure. Well, I should tell you, first of all, I came from University of Calgary. So, and I don't have a journalism degree, a political science degree, but my sense is just be human. Be who you are, communicate naturally. We're not asking you to tell us all your secrets. Have a conversation with people. What Chantal was saying about the banter and talking back and forth and actually getting to know people, to think about, from the larger perspective as your movement, what are we really about? If you're talking to your mom at home and she's totally apolitical, how do you explain what you're about? Why is this something you believe in? Why is it something you think is important? And explain. Be willing to explain the arguments behind it. Be willing to give the facts. Be willing to stand up to the criticism you may have on that in a way that isn't, again, seeing it as a threat, but sees it as an opportunity to explain and take on those arguments and strengthen your own. So from my perspective as a journalist, if you want to communicate with me, just call me up and say, do you want to go for a coffee? Sure, happy to, right? I don't need you to tell me anything. Sometimes we'll talk about nothing. That first coffee will just be getting to know each other. Where are you from? What do you do? And to have that, and to think about who you want to be and to get those messages out, not to focus so much on what's the message, what's the soundbite. That's part of it, because you have to get into the media cycle. But that will come more naturally once you start to establish a comfort level with communicating at all.
Yeah. It really isn't that difficult. I mean, look at me. I'm getting paid now for what I used to get detentions for in high school, so I think everybody can do it. Maybe I'll go over here for another question.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Anne-Marie, and I'm with the Carleton School of Political Management. My question is for anyone who would like to answer this. In general, I'm hearing a lot of ideas around tone, personality, this kind of thing. To me, politics is inspirational. When I see a leader, I want to be inspired to follow what they are talking about. So I know that tone is important, personality is important. What do you think is important for people to be inspired by a leader?
I don't think that leaders come in a cereal box, and there's the top grade, and then there's the bottom shelf one. I think, to go back to points that were made earlier, it's anybody who is a leader can inspire if it comes across that they are true to themselves and their ideas. Authenticity sells a lot better than any polished lesson you could pick up in a speaking school. And people see through you if you are not authentic. Otherwise, look at the people who have been leaders in this country, provincially and federally. We have a real wide range. But what they have in common, the successful ones, is that they came across as authentic. And sometimes they actually worked on that. You can sound like you're saying everything you're thinking with knowing in your head that where the line is. But being authentic is more important than being charismatic, I think.
Yeah, one of my lines is that charisma lasts a couple weeks in Canadian politics. And I like that Chantal mentioned provincial leaders. If you look at the last several Ontario premiers to get reelected, Kathleen Wynne, Dalton McGuinty, Mike Harris, each of whom was enraged their political opponents, each of whom was able to build a broad movement of Ontarians who were happy to get behind him because, to their audience, they felt like they meant what they were saying and that they were in it for a reason besides personal advancement, Which, and I say this with affection, in Mr. McGuinty's case, was a hell of a trick. And if you look at all the 30 or so people who've been running for the U.S. president this year, it's not obvious. It would not have been obvious to me 6 months ago that Bernie Sanders would have been one of the ones to rise. So if you go for a kind of a surface conception of glamour, you just almost always wind up with a dud. If you seek a leader that you don't believe, but you're pretty sure you can sell them to other Canadians, you will lose every time. You got to find a leader that you want to have as your prime minister, for starters. That's no guarantee, but you're doomed if you don't do that.
Kim Campbell comes to mind.
Yeah.
Chosen for the wrong reasons. This is not a judgment on her, but a judgment on the party that picked her, because she was going to be so different from Brian Mulroney. And you have this debate over why women aren't voting for Hillary Clinton and shouldn't they be. We had this debate here in 1993, but the Conservatives who selected her clearly didn't select her for what they saw as her strengths, but rather for the marketing of that leader.
Great. Okay, another question from the right-hand side.
So I have to admit I'm somewhat paranoid about journalists, and
even paranoids have enemies,
Well, that was going to be my point.
Trust sensibilities.
But I became less paranoid about journalists. I and a couple of my friends organized something called the Fabulous Blue Tent, and we invited a lot of journalists, and a lot of people came, and I saw them as much more friendly and human than before. And I'm wondering, maybe we need to have more parties, as you know. And
That's an offer of free alcohol. I accept.
well, we're going to have another one in Vancouver, so you're all welcome to come. But you know, should we socialize more? I mean, I know Mr. Cameron in Britain had a program to try and schmooze the BBC journalists. I mean, is that what we need to do?
Well, to Mercedes' point about just, hey, call me up and we'll go for coffee, and maybe in the first meeting nothing will happen. I think that at least the advantage and what builds upon that is then you've made that relationship. So when you send the email saying, hey, Anthony, hey, Mercedes, I found out this news, or there's this report you should look at, you're not going, you know, who's this crazy guy from the bunker getting in touch with me? You go, oh, it's him. Yeah, you know, I appreciate that guy's sensibilities. You know, I'm going to look into what he's talking about. I trust it. So, yeah, relationship building, totally.
Good. Oh, the mic over there.
Yeah, I've got a question. We're talking about bringing all conservatives together and the different types of conservatives in the movement, bringing them into the party. But I think there's a real disconnect between older conservatives and younger conservatives. I mean, I see it all the time. I know a lot of young conservatives who think very differently than the conservatives that are, you know, a generation ago, back in the Reform Party, for example. So how do you bridge that gap? Because, of course, there are a lot of older conservatives that are very wise, been in this game, know what they're talking about, but looking towards the youth and getting the youth engaged, having youth here there's so many of them here, uniting them, bringing them together, and having a collated, like some sort of message that we can sell to all Canadians, because there is that big divide, and it's hard sometimes. I mean, a lot of people don't take the youth seriously. They say, young whippersnappers, you don't know what you're talking about. But no, I mean, we are the future. So how do you bridge that gap? And that goes for really any one of you there.
Except the moderator.
I would say, actually, Jim, you would have a lot of insights. I'm looking forward to your memoirs.
It'd be a coloring book, actually. Maybe a scratch and sniff, Paul. That would be my name.
Yeah. I would say never stop talking to one another. And be tolerant of differences of opinion within the movement as a good first step to going out and showing to the rest of the country that you're as good at that or better at that than the other political movements. One thing I do want to say is that there are in the Canadian Conservative movement a small number of people who have completely lost the difference between being willing to fight for your beliefs, being willing to stand up for your beliefs, and a compelling inability to ever stop fighting. A good rule of thumb is that if I've blocked you on Twitter, you're doing it wrong. And I think we know who of I speak. People who used to cover this event and now have decided that the entire event is beyond the pale of Canadian conservatism are the problem.
But maybe Paul, I can maybe take a crack at it, just because, you know, when I was involved in the Reform Party back in, you know, '94, it really was a party of equals, right? There was no real hierarchy, not even the leader, right? It was a party of equals. So we were fairly young. We were brought in. We actually did work that we would never in a million years have been asked to do in any other party. Right? We weren't licking stamps. We weren't making phone calls. We were actually writing policy. We were, you know, putting together the election platform. We were doing all of this, right? And I think we need to get back to that. That yes, it's great to have former cabinet ministers, to have really important people, to have big money, and the brothers and the sisters and the daughters and the sons of big money. But you know, that really can't become the party. We have to get back to being a party of equals, where everybody can take a crack at the policy. You don't have to necessarily be the expert. Here endeth the lesson. So maybe